This next story is really good. It's he tells me he doesn't want me to use his name, but he doesn't say not to use the area. This happens in Spencer County, Indiana. My family, my friends, and I used to ride ATVs every weekend, and I had the biggest four-wheeler at the time. I was one of the youngest family members. I usually stayed in the very back in case someone got into trouble or hung up so that I could get them out. My wife at the time was riding with me. There was about 15 ATVs that night, and we were going through a post-flood old-growth forest with trees that were massive, and you wouldn't believe it. There was still water ponded up on the forest floor. As we went around and up a long left muddy turn, I thought I saw a large black figure step out from behind a tree and in front of my cousin Annette's four-wheeler. She didn't see it because everyone was looking to the left following the lead four-wheelers. Then it stepped back behind the giant tree, and I told myself, I didn't just see that. It looked hairy, but I wasn't sure, and I kept telling myself that I was seeing things. My wife didn't see it because she was looking over my left shoulder. As I approached the tree, I was starting to turn left myself, and I knew what I had seen, but I was hoping that it wasn't real. As soon as I went past the tree, he and I locked eyes, and I could have grabbed his arm. At that time, I was 37, and I had never known fear. I was 6 foot tall and a 265-pound farm boy who was all muscle and freak show strong. But as soon as we looked at each other, other primal fears struck me like a bolt of lightning. The only way to describe it is a feeling that is made of doom, fear, sorrow, disappointment, hopelessness, all wrapped up in one super fear that is so overpowering that it's crippling. I never said anything to my wife because I was afraid she would scream and freak the thing out. It was massive and was barely hiding behind this tree. It was tight against the tree with both hands flat on it and its chest tight against its hands. What happened next was very strange to me, but I know they are more than just an animal now. When he and I looked at each other, we both knew we had goofed and got caught in among that chain of ATVs. I was instantly terrified, but then instantly knew he was as scared as I was and wanted this situation to end. It was like we were in each other's head and came to an agreement. He was at least 8.5 feet tall. I was the same height on my four-wheeler as I was when I was standing, and I looked way up at this thing. It's funny how small you feel. This thing could have easily grabbed me, my wife, or the entire ATV and threw us. That's how powerful it looked. I can't put into words how powerful it looked. I have gone online several times to try to see what I saw. I've seen the white one on YouTube, but this thing looked more human. People report red triangulated eyes, smelly and long matted hair, but this one had none of that. Its coat was brownish orange with 2 to 3 inches straight hair. I could see grayish skin and muscle mass. There is no bodybuilder on the planet with the size muscle mass this thing had. Not much of a neck, but its head was huge. Its eyes were 2 to 3 times bigger, but just like ours with whites in the pupils. The whites of his eyes I'll never forget because his eyes were what I struck on the most. The rest of him was at a glance. His mouth was wide. It was 4 or 5 inches wide, and its lips were pulled tight from fear. As I pulled away, he took one step and vanished. I was amazed at how he had just gone that quick. I think fear comes from another time. I think man knows this thing well from the past. We may have knocked it off the evolutionary trail and left them behind. As far as these things go, he was handsome and in his prime. He was broad at the shoulder and narrow at the hip. A true specimen. I don't want to be criticized, so if you don't mind, don't use my name. Dude, that's terrifying. I mean, people see these things from a distance, but no, you rarely hear where they just pull right up to one. So obviously, you guys caught him in a precarious position, and he was just hugging that tree, just trying to hoping you guys would go by and not see him. But you saw him. It's a pretty cool encounter. Obviously, it made a big imprint on your mind because you remember so many details. But dude, that's a great story. I appreciate you, buddy. Hey, I meant to tell y'all I was invited to be a guest on a show on the Dark Waters Network. It's called Chasing the Truth. Shawn Graham is the host. Here's the thumbnail he's going to throw up for his show. It's this Saturday night, September the 28th at 7 o'clock Central Time. You can tune in. It's a live show. I think it's a call-in show. His number, let's see, I wrote his number down. Shawn Graham's show is 931-994-6917. I'll say it one more time. 931-994-6917. If you want to call in and ask me a question or ask him a question, or I think James, the owner of the network, is going to be on that show with us. So you guys tune in to Dark Waters. I'll put a link to their YouTube channel, but they also have a radio station. This guy's doing all kind of cool stuff. And he's got he's got the Siege at Lockett Ranch. It's one of my favorite Dogman stories of all time. I'll link the channel below and you guys can go over there, but I want to let you know that. All right, let's get to another story. Here's a story from someone who wishes to be anonymous, and it's real interesting to me. I hope you enjoy it. I haven't told anyone about this, not even my household. First, I'll say that I grew up and still live in the woods in southeastern Pennsylvania. My dog is a half beagle and half pug and has seen every type of animal that lives in this area. So identifying any of those is easy enough for the dog. At that time, I was taking my dog 3 or 4 times a week, a couple of miles from my house, to a park that has several hiking trails. One is about 2 miles in a loop, and the other is about 4 miles, and it drops down to a large creek that runs into the Susquehanna River. I think I got that right. And then wraps back up through a field and to the parking area. I should also mention that my dog is quite fearless. She does well with other animals, but she doesn't seem to get overly cautious. She'll even try to greet horses that pass by when people are riding them on the upper section of the trail. One afternoon, I decided to take her over to walk the small loop, since there wasn't enough time to walk the larger loop. I decided to walk it in the reverse direction to how we normally walked. It is a walk down a grass lane with woods on either side for the first quarter or so of the trail. We got about 100 yards off the grass and into the woods when she stopped and stared forward at something. Her tail was down and her front paw was raised. At first I didn't think much of it. Being half beagle, she is always hearing or smelling things that catch her attention. I looked in the approximate direction to try to see what it was, but I didn't see anything. This is a section of woods that has a lot of vines and what looks like dried briars from the past season. It's also close to where the trail splits in a Y shape, and the one path cuts down to the hill to the creek and continues to the larger trail. In this area, we'll often see bedding areas for deer and holes cut through briars that smaller animals have made. We have often seen foxes cross our path at a distance in here as well. I tried to get her to start moving, but she absolutely refused. In fact, she kept trying to turn around and leave, with her body slightly lower to the ground. I can't stress enough how abnormal this is for her, so I decided to crouch down with her and see if she wanted any water. I use a small bowl that I dump water in from a bottle into. As I'm holding the bowl and trying to get her attention, now being really close to her head level, I decided to try to line up with what she was looking at. The woods here has some decently large trees for the East Coast, definitely wide enough at the base for a grown man to hide behind. So my attention moved to a set of trees that were connected at the base. I'm thinking she was watching squirrels, but I couldn't figure out why she was scared. That's when I noticed that about 3 feet up, where the trees separate from each other at different angles, there was something there. I could tell because it was a different brown color from the bark on these trees, and I couldn't see any of the woods between them. We were probably close to 100 feet from this group of trees. I should also mention that there aren't any bear in this area. When you spend your life in the woods, you know when something doesn't look right in your surroundings, and my mind could not come up with an explanation for what I was looking at. I didn't see a face or anything, but we looked at this for long enough, and I knew it wasn't moss, vines, or leaves, or anything of that nature. My mind was telling me that it was hair. After a couple of minutes, suddenly the top 3 feet of the figure or so dropped down, and something showed out the side of the tree. It looked like whatever it was went from standing to crouching down. We both had the same idea at that point, and that was to turn around and leave the same way that we had come in. She still wouldn't move, so I picked her up and got out of there. At first, I was watching it as much as I could, but I was traveling the other direction. One of the times I looked back, it was completely gone. It couldn't have been more than 5 seconds that I looked away. Just before I was back to the grass lane, I could hear what sounded like large branches breaking, almost like whatever it was trying to make loud noises. I never saw anything odd in any of the other 100+ times that we were in those woods. I'm sorry this might be too long, but I wanted to try to give you as much detail as I could. Okay, sir, the detail is good. People who listen to these stories sometimes love the little details, so I think that's great. I think a lot of people see things like this in the woods, and they walk away going, well, that was just light. That was, wind blowing a brush pile. That was this, that, or the other. When in reality, it may have been what you thought. But the people are so afraid to say, I think I saw a Bigfoot, that they never talk about it. And that's what's good about this story. It's kind of letting people know, I think, that there are things that you may see in the woods that I wouldn't necessarily be afraid of, but sometimes you can lock in and just watch it for a long time, and then you're able to discern, well, it is the light, because within 10 minutes light will change in the woods. The woods look different every 15 minutes. Just sit there and watch it and see what you got, because normally there are very, very few stories of these things hurting people. Very, very few. And sometimes I think it's worth just staying still, keeping your eyes locked on whatever you're looking at, and just try to see what you can see. But anyway, I think this is a great story. Thanks so much for sending it in. This encounter was sent by Sheila. She lives in Kentucky. She writes, it was a cold winter day in January. The rain and below freezing temperatures on our mountain had turned the snow on the ground to ice. The exact year I cannot recall, other than to estimate it took place in the late 1970s. Our grandparents' property, nestled snugly between 2 mountains, was the last house located in the holler where we lived. As you can imagine, the property was surrounded by thick, lush forest. A creek ran parallel with the road just 35 yards away from the house. Surprisingly, with the freezing cold temperatures, the water was still flowing down out of the mountain, filling the creek to overflow. My cousin and I, visiting with our grandparents that morning, learned the water pipes to the house were frozen solid. Attempts that were made to winterize the house that year seemed to be in vain. The two of us, wanting to help, volunteered to hike a short distance up the mountain, following the creek to a small pond where we could comfortably fill empty, clean plastic jugs with water to bring back to the house to be used for washing dishes and bathing. During this time period, drinking water from our creek was a common occurrence. However, since that time, due to coal mining blasts dislodging the earth of our mountain and more frequent animal use, drinking water out of the creek today would not be advisable. After breakfast, we put on layers of clothing along with boots, gloves, and hats. We each carried 4 empty plastic jugs apiece between us, up the mountain less than a fourth of a mile from the house. The cold wind bit through our layers of clothing, so we picked up our pace, anxious to be done with the task and return to the warmth of the house. Once we arrived at the spot where the water ran a little slower, we placed the jugs on the ground and started to take the lids off in preparation to fill them. My cousin, who was kneeling on the frozen ground, began to fill the jugs with water from the slow-moving portion of the creek. As each jug was filled, he would hand it back to me to secure the lid on it. In between time to fill each jug, I looked around, enjoying the beauty of the tree limbs lined with the icy snow on them, when I noticed a shadow of a burly-looking figure peer from around a tree at me. Thinking it was a hunter, I was about to call out hello when I noticed the muscle-bound, hairy arms circling the circumference of the tree. Too big to completely hide behind the tree, the portion of its body that I could see was covered in hair. In seconds, I realized this was no hunter, and certainly not a bear. I had seen plenty of bear, and this was not one of them. It only took seconds for me to establish its height to be between 6 and 7 feet tall. Its conical-shaped head tilted from side to side, seemingly curious about what we were doing. I was unable to get a clear look at its face due to all the hair. It was then that I realized I was looking at a Bigfoot. Fear flooded my body to the point where I found myself completely frozen where I stood. Afraid to make any sudden moves because of the close proximity we were to it, I nervously called out to my cousin to look across the creek. Oblivious to the urgency of the sound of my voice, he ignored me and continued to fill the last jug with water. I tried to get his attention. It was then, out of exasperation, he stood up in a bit of a huff to see what I wanted to show him. I watched his face as he saw what I had been staring at for what seemed like 10 minutes, but was at best no more than a minute. Dropping the jug of water to the ground, the only word I heard him utter was, "Run!" That is exactly what we did, leaving the water-filled jugs behind. How we were able to get down that icy, snow-covered mountain without falling and breaking our necks is anyone's guess. Hesitant to divulge what we had seen, we both decided it was best that our grandparents knew what was lurking in the woods around their home. After a lengthy discussion, it was agreed we would keep the incident to ourselves out of fear of being labeled crazy among the members of the small coal mining community. Just a side note, I'm a writer and a published author. Presently, I'm writing a second book to go with the first one that is already published on Amazon. The name of the book is Crevices by Sheila Anderson. I was drawn to your channel, of course, because of the storytelling, which naturally I love. You are welcome to edit this story as needed to fit with your channel. You have my support for such a great channel. Eventually, with time permitting, I will send you a second story. Well, there you go. Another up in the mountains of Kentucky. You know, I used to live in Kentucky. I had to travel on the eastern part of the state. It gets dark there in those mountains real quick. When the sun goes down and it goes down the top of the ridge of a mountain, it gets dark in those woods real quick. It always kind of amazed me. I'm from the Delta, the flatlands, and it stays light until the sun goes down over the horizon. But there's some creepy woods up in there, and it's real rugged terrain. So I kind of know the area. But yeah, you know, there they are, filling up jugs of water. She looks up and there's a Bigfoot, probably just watching them, just observing them. It's a great story, Sheila. Thanks so much for sending it. We loved it. This last set of encounters is by one person. I thoroughly enjoyed reading this, and I hope you enjoy it too. She wants to leave her name out of it. She writes, I enjoy your stories very much. I like that you don't embellish the stories and you read them as they are. They go along with the encounters I have had throughout my life. A little about myself. I am a 75-year-old great-grandmother who has been an outdoor girl all my life. I have spent many backpacking, treasure hunting, and camping trips in the wilderness areas from states on the East Coast, the Appalachian Mountains, California, and Colorado. I currently live on the front range of the Rockies, surrounded by national forest, state forest, and BLM land at about 8,500 feet. Wow, I bet it's beautiful up there. My first Bigfoot encounter was in upstate New York, about 30 miles north of Syracuse, on the shores of Lake Ontario. While visiting my grandmother there, I used to sneak out and run a couple of blocks away where there was an old cemetery. Black Creek ran through it, and if there was a creek anywhere, I was down exploring it. I went to the edge of the cemetery and slipped through the fence and went down to the edge of the creek. The hillside down to the creek was covered with grass and was slippery. I had to be very careful not to slip into the creek, which was deep and murky looking. While creeping along the creek's edge, I suddenly looked up to see a creature covered with sienna-colored hair. It was squatted down on its haunches, leaning forward, doing something in the shallow water. From the motions it was making, I thought it was washing something. I could see well-defined buttocks that looked human, only covered with hair. In my 10-year-old brain, the only creature that could possibly be that large was a bear. Since I only saw the backside of the creature, I had no idea what the head looked like. From the size of what I saw, if it had stood up, I think it would have been around 5.5 feet tall, a little taller than me. I'm guessing now that it weighed about 100 to 120 pounds. My heart was pounding, and I spun around and ran up the hill to the fence and through it and ran as fast as I could all the way to my grandmother's house. Of course, I told everyone that I had seen a bear. Grandmother said that there were no bears around here, and I must have seen a groundhog. Even at that age, I knew it wasn't a groundhog and always wondered what it was. From that time on, I was fascinated with stories of unknown creatures. My second encounter was when I was 27. In 1973, my boyfriend and I vacationed in a cabin in the Trinity Alps in Northern California along the Trinity River. The cabin was at the end of a small, narrow valley surrounded on one side by the river and the other by the mountains. We had been there 5 days when the boyfriend wanted to go down into Redding to eat dinner at a nice restaurant. It was about 9:30 p.m. as we pulled off the highway onto the little dirt road that ran through the woods, over the bridge, and to our cabin. It was very dark as we got into the woods, and I suddenly had a feeling of apprehension as if something was watching us. We parked by the cabin and went in, and I walked through the cabin making sure all the windows and doors were locked and that the curtains were drawn. I told my boyfriend that I had a bad feeling and I thought that we should stay in the cabin. He, on the other hand, wanted to go for a walk. It was a dark night and I already had an eerie feeling. I didn't want to go, but I allowed him to talk me into it. I remember teasing him, saying, "Okay, big city boy, are you going to protect me from the wild animals?" And he didn't think that was funny at all. We walked down the little dirt road, chatting quietly for a little while. Suddenly, just off to my right, in the berry bushes, I heard a very low, extremely deep growl. That growl sounded as if it was coming from an enormous set of lungs. The sound sort of echoed from its own body. I had never heard anything like it. Even many years later, after lots of experience in the wilderness with its creatures and their habits and sounds, I have never heard anything nearly like this. I stopped dead in my tracks and asked, "Did you hear that?" And my boyfriend said, "Nice try, you're not going to scare me." We walked about 10 or 15 feet farther and it growled again, only this time it was closer. My boyfriend sounded frightened and said, "I did hear it that time. What do we do? Run?" And I said, "No, we don't run." I turned toward the middle of the valley and walked in that direction for about 100 feet, and then I turned left back towards the cabin. When we got close enough to run, I said, "Now we run." We ran all the way back to the cabin. Again, I made sure all the windows and doors were secure. By this time, it was 10:30 p.m., and we went to bed. He was asleep almost as soon as his head hit the pillow, but I couldn't sleep. I just laid quietly listening. It wasn't long before I began to hear heavy crunching noises in the gravel just outside the cabin. Whatever it was seemed to be on 2 feet. It would make very long, slow steps that I could actually feel. It walked around and around the cabin. The creature seemed to be very heavy. Whenever I would hear a step, the next step seemed to be 4 or 5 feet further away. Whatever it was had long legs. I shook my boyfriend to wake him, while whispering in his ear to be quiet and just listen. We laid there for about an hour before my boyfriend fell back to sleep. I, however, stayed awake listening to the footsteps for at least 2 more hours, terrified to peek out the window, and I had a feeling it could hear me move. I was terrified to even breathe. Finally, sometime before dawn, I must have fallen asleep. The first thing in the morning, I went outside to see if I could see footprints, but there were only indentions in the gravel that were too indistinct to be able to identify. I have never been more frightened in all my life. It wasn't until years later that I became aware of how close to Bluff Creek we were, and to become aware that a Bigfoot film was actually made very close to that cabin by Bob Gimlin. My third experience. My fiance and I had backpacked into the, I can't even pronounce this, Weminook Wilderness about 9 miles from the car. It was mid-September, so the tourists had all gone home. The 2 of us were the only ones in the area for many miles. We had no weapons, only a couple of knives. We didn't even have a dog. We were camped at a small alpine lake just below the timberline. It was a beautiful evening, and we had a fire going. We were chatting and just gazing at the stars and listening to the fish jump in the lake. It must have been about 10 p.m. when we began hearing sticks and even larger sticks and then logs cracking. We at first thought it might be a bear stepping on sticks and breaking them. But when the sounds got louder, we could tell that whatever it was breaking was getting larger as well. And we began to become frightened. Now we're on the edge. We listened for quite a while, and the sounds became closer and louder. The only thing we could think to do was make a fire as large as we dared without burning down the forest. Whatever was out there never came any closer, and we listened for hours. We finally decided we couldn't stay awake any longer. If it wanted to kill us, it would have done it before now. So we went to bed. The next morning, we took off back to the trailhead as soon as there was light in the sky. We couldn't get out of there fast enough. Now I live in the mountains surrounded by the forest. I have found teepee structures as well as other structures literally everywhere in these mountains. Some I have found are only about 100 to 200 feet from a road, and others are close to houses. I am amazed how many of these creatures there really are, and how easy it is to spot their structures if you just get out and look. I think they are all around us, and that they are much closer than we think. And then she signs off. That is a wonderful, wonderful set of encounters. I think gives a lot of information, and she's paying attention. And this may not have anything to do with this story, but I keep hearing this phrase over and over, that only certain people see these things. In other words, they choose who they want to see them, or they choose who they want to hear them or be close to them. And maybe this woman, this 75-year-old great-grandmother, through her life, had a demeanor about her that the creatures thought was unaggressive and peaceful, and they moved around her, and maybe they're feeling like getting close to her. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how to figure this all out. But it makes me think about those things, because when people have encounters over and over and over, there's something to that. Because I'm out in the woods quite a bit. I mean, all my life I'm not a woodsman or anything like that, but I've never seen anything. And some people are out in the woods and they see these things all the time, or they come in proximity with them all the time. So anyway, it's just a few of my thoughts. I think that's going to do it for this video. I hope you guys liked it, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you.